You're listening to The Gulf Stream, the official podcast of the Harte Research Institute for Gulf of Mexico Studies at Texas A&M University, Corpus Christi.
I think there's a quote, and it may just be general, it may be, but my father imparted upon me that there's nothing better for land than a man or a woman's shadow.
Yeah.
And I think that's, obviously you can take that into other parts of your life, but being there is really important. And so I think that's some of what I've learned, over the years.
Let's dive in. All right, Jay Kleberg, welcome to the Gulf Stream podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us. You are no stranger to HRI these days, and we've been seeing you around the halls, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But before we get too deep into this, I'll introduce myself to our viewers and listeners again. My name is Radke. I'm the communications coordinator here at HRI, and I'm a producer and host of our little show here. So always excited to be talking to some new folks. And so you're a lot of things, a lot of good things.
Yeah, good.
You're a conservationist. You've worked with the Texas Parks and Wildlife Foundation. You're, the executive director of the Gulf of Mexico Trust, which I'm really excited to chat with you about.
Yeah.
You're a producer, a filmmaker. So, in your own words, just tell our viewers and listeners a little bit about yourself.
And a father. That's one I feel like professionally we always forget.
For sure.
Those responsibilities. I grew up not too far from here in Kingsville, and have spent the early part of my career in conservation. Was living in Brazil, in the Brazilian Amazon, for about 3 years, trying to do some of the work that I'm doing now and convening people from the private sector and conservation organizations to conserve habitat, basically.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And then I was in the private sector for a little while. I was in real estate for about a decade along the U.S.-Mexico border.
Wow. Okay.
And then decided after the last recession that, if you look at cycles, it was going to happen again.
Mm-hmm.
And so decided to go back to school. I went to business school at UT in Austin.
Okay.
And there, realized that through an internship with the National Park Service,
oh, wow.
Where I got to do a business plan for the Grand Canyon, that there was
no big deal.
No big deal, right?
Yeah.
And what's interesting now is we did this business plan, and some of the work that we did was related to investments that a park could make and squirrel away funds for big infrastructure projects.
Okay.
And now we're seeing a lot of that come to fruition. So they're going to be updating the water system that takes water from the North Rim and delivers it down to the bottom of the canyon,
mm-hmm.
and then back up to the South Rim. They're going to be making those investments like in the next few years.
That's
and so
awesome.
Saw at that point the intersection of my business experience and conservation experience and where I had grown up, and an interest in wildlife and habitat and all of that come to fore. So
I love that.
Started with Parks and Wildlife Foundation, and then have continued, a lot of that work. And I would say that the film and the professional side of things in conservation, and you are realizing this too, is that you can't just do the work.
Mm-hmm.
You also have to advocate for it and communicate out. And I think as an industry, if you will, on the conservation and research side, that we haven't done as good of a job as we could have in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And things are changing, right? So you've got to be doing it in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's why we're sitting here right now, right? We have this medium, this podcast medium, to talk about conservation, to talk about science, talk about research, but discuss it in a way that, a wider audience can listen to it, a wider audience can understand, and therefore, find their own connection with those things. And so I think through film especially, and we'll get into this a little bit more, but through film especially, that really gives people an opportunity that maybe aren't the outdoors people, but they can see these landscapes, they can see, wildlife issues and recognize how important that stuff is, and then make their own connection to it. So
yeah, we're fighting for people's attention, just like in the private sector, you're fighting for the money that's in people's wallets or their bank account, and that we're advocating in many cases or creating awareness for things that can't speak for themselves.
Yeah.
Right? It's a natural resource. It's a bird or it's a fish, and also putting it into terms that people can understand, and initially trying to get their attention.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And trying to make them fall in love with something, so that either at that point or sometime in the future when they are asked to care, that they do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's great. That's a wonderful way to put that. Talking a little bit about, falling in love and connecting with the outdoors. This is a little bit of an icebreaker thing to talk about, but, an audio podcast is one thing, but when you've got 3 cameras pointed at you, can be a little awkward. So I thought an icebreaker question might be kind of fun, but, so people might not know that you are a runner. You're a trail runner. I'm also a runner. And so you've run the Leadville Silver Rush 50.
Yeah.
And anybody that's into ultra running and they hear Leadville, they know what that means. And when I say 50, I mean 50 miles. That's a pretty big deal. So kudos to you on that.
Thanks.
That's a pretty amazing feat. But what I like to hear from other runners especially is what is it that you really like about running, and trail running in particular? Like, how does that help you, connect to the outdoors and also connect to yourself?
Yeah. I think probably the common thread amongst most runners, especially, so I'm in my mid 40s, is that it's a time, and I run early in the morning, and normally it's not light out yet. And so I get a chance to do that with a few other people. So for me, it's a little bit of a social thing. There's not a whole lot of gear. It's just you and your shoes and your body and maybe a headlamp. And you're able to focus on one thing. So it's great for me intellectually to be involved in all of these things, but it also means that I'm distracted or I'm scattered at certain points. I have to kind of compartmentalize things as I go through the day. That's the first point normally of my day where I can just focus on one thing. Yeah. And it's not falling normally.
Yeah, for sure.
And in the process, I'm catching up with friends, and also I'm improving my health.
You're doing something for yourself.
I'm doing something for myself. And I'd say the last thing is, for me, it's a bit of a meditative process. Yeah. And so, rather than sitting down in a quiet place for 15 minutes and collecting my thoughts, I get to do it for, however long I'm out there. And also I think specifically trail running, it's like a real connection to the work. Yeah. It's easier. It's easy to do what we are doing and, recreate, let's say, on the weekends, but spend a lot of time in the office. And that's a way for me to remember why I'm doing these things.
Yeah, for sure.
So I've gotten to really enjoy it. And the last thing I would say is it's a very beyond road running. And I got into triathlons and all these other things previously. There's no gear. And especially even with these races, there's a real sense of camaraderie, and there's a competitiveness to the races, but also, I did a race out in the Davis Mountains, and the guy who won was like wearing a flannel shirt and I think maybe jean shorts or something,
Yeah.
And it's like only in trail running, would you see that? So people aren't overly serious about themselves.
That's so true. And I think that's something that I noticed when I'm not a lifelong runner by any means. I just started running in the last few years, and first few trail races I did, it was just cool to see that it wasn't taken very seriously, and you pass a person or a person passes you and it's all these like pats on the back, and it's like, great effort, runner, you got this. And so that sense of community is really nice. But I totally agree. It's such a meditative thing. Just yesterday, I had one of those like my Forrest Gump moments. I've got a lot going on around here, and it's all good stuff. But like you said, there's a lot of noise in my brain. I'm in the middle of a move, and so I just set out to to get a couple miles in, and 5 miles later, I'm still having a great day. I'm still having a great time, and so I come home and I just feel so much better. But you're right. It's just really nice to have that connection.
And I think I was talking to someone else about this who had been an endurance runner for a long period of time, and then they stopped doing that for the very reason that you and I were just talking about. They were too much in their head. So I think for some people it's too much.
Yeah.
But for me, all of the good and bad creative ideas and some transformational times in my life, they have come from time outdoors. So it's either that like 45 minutes and there's a great book that's called The Nature Fix, and it talks about time outdoors, kind of if you think about it linearly, the more time that you spend, and it's called backcountry brain, and it's I think 48 hours plus. If you're attuned to it, and I think you probably are one of these people, you've had those experiences where you've been camping or you've been in the outdoors for a couple of days, and all of a sudden you're having these like super creative thoughts, or you think, I hadn't thought of that before. And in some instances, my wife always jokes because whenever I come back from something like that, I have some grand idea. And she's like waiting for it. But there's science. It's very cool because you have this natural experience that's not tied to the lab or anything, but they've actually gone back and from a neuroscience perspective, they can identify that truly is something that's happening in your brain. And so you're getting something from it.
Yeah, for sure. I think I've heard of something similar. It might be from the same book, but I know that I've heard Stephen Ornella from Meader talk about something similar. And when you're out in the backcountry for so long and you don't have access to your phone and you don't have access to your email, you just become so much more in tune with yourself and so much more in tune with everything that's going on around you, and just a more like natural version of yourself. And it's only something that the outdoors can do. So it's really special. But so talking about the outdoors and more of your connection to it. So you mentioned it when we got started. You have a big connection to South Texas. You have a big connection to Texas. So correct me if I'm wrong, but you grew up on the King Ranch. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. And so our viewers and listeners have probably heard of the King Ranch. If nothing else, they've probably seen, a King Ranch edition Ford truck go by and, wondered like, what's the deal with that? So King Ranch is a very large piece of property. It's here in South Texas. It's larger than the state of Rhode Island. But so there's a lot of history and a lot of, big Texas legacy associated with the King Ranch. So I would love it if you could, just kind of dip your toes into that a little bit and explain some of that.
And Corpus has a tie to all of it because Captain Richard King and Mifflin Kennedy were steamboat captains on the Rio Grande in the 1830s and the 40s. And Captain King came to Corpus for the equivalent of a state fair, and had ridden through a sea of grass, essentially between Brownsville and here, the Wild Horse Desert. And it was sort of on the waning years of the steamboat business at that point. And he, I think, was looking for a way to diversify what he had built down on the Rio Grande, and bought some land on the Santa Gertrudis Creek around 1853. And then ultimately, he passes away in 1885, and Mrs. King doubles the acreage to more than 1 million acres. Today, it's about 825,000 acres, but she doesn't get a whole lot of credit. He's sort of the face of all of it, but she helped build it to impart what it is today. And then one of my ancestors, Robert Kleberg, who beat Captain King in a case here in Corpus, ends up marrying his daughter. Okay. And so that's how we sort of entered into the lineage. And one of the things that I think is interesting to what I'm doing today is there's still a few through lines from those original, that original formation. Is he did all of this for economic reasons. And I think a lot of what you see in Texas in terms of conservation, because we were 95% privately owned, that yes, there is philanthropy involved, but a lot of things just make good economic sense.
Right.
And so when you look at in the mid 1980s, when we opened up the ranch to hunting and the hunting leases, it made good economic sense to do that. And now look at where that industry is in Texas, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And then from a conservation standpoint, Jay Kleberg goes down and he's living in Cuero. He's a cousin of Robert Kleberg and ends up managing Norius, which is a division that's south of Baffin Bay, kind of near Raymondville, and really is at the forefront at that point of the railroad, the port of Corpus Christi being developed, and seeing what lack of regulation and market hunting was doing to waterfowl and white-tailed deer and turkey.
Okay.
And so he set out some of the first sort of Aldo Leopold-like regulations on the ranch, and then was one of the first state preserves, which we had in the 1930s, that were meant to repopulate the state with white-tailed deer and turkey, because those populations were declining. And then he was on the predecessor to Parks and Wildlife Commission, and set up the first conservation foundation, so private foundation for conservation of wildlife in the state of Texas.
Okay.
So there's a lot of sort of those genetics that are, I think, in me, whether I knew it or not, in terms of my professional career. And the ranches continue to do a lot of that work today. And Jay Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute was established by Caesar. He didn't have any children, and so he had some mineral interest, set up a foundation with about $10,000 worth of funds that today has helped to keep Jay Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute at the forefront of what it's doing.
Yeah, they certainly do some great work, and you know, we've been good partners with them. So, you know, it's interesting talking about the private land aspect of things, and you know, the conservation that takes place on those private lands. You know, I know that it's a conversation a lot among, you know, a lot of Texans, and I especially heard it when I was in my previous position at Texas Parks and Wildlife. I was in the press office working with the wildlife division. Okay. And so I dealt a lot with a program called Lone Star Land Stewards. Yeah. And so those are the landowners, you know, throughout the state that are just out there doing the most for not only their land, but, you know, as a result, like the nearby cities and you know, the creeks and the reservoirs that, you know, something that is on their land is flowing into. Absolutely. Right? And so, you know, people might hate the fact that Texas is so privately owned and may say, you know, where's our public land? And you know, we do have it. We have public hunting lands. I don't unfortunately have any private land of my own, so most of the hunting I do is on public hunting lands. Yep. You just have to know where to find that kind of thing, right? But again, you know, so much of that conservation is taking place on those private lands, and I think that I'll read really quickly just a quote from the former executive director, Carter Smith, because he can put things in words a lot better than I would ever be able to. So this was something about Lone Star Land Stewards. He said that Texas is predominantly privately owned. Irrespective of who you are and where you live, if you care anything about where the raindrops fall and where our aquifers are recharged and where our springs, creeks, and rivers flow, our fish and wildlife habitats, where our clean air and water are derived, those places are largely found on private lands in Texas. Private landowners are the ones who wake up every day and work on stewarding those things that we all get to enjoy, sometimes directly and sometimes indirectly. And so when you're talking about, you know, the efforts that, you know, these private landowners are making to, you know, restore populations of wild turkey, restore populations of white-tailed deer, you know, that's a really big deal. And so how did, you know, growing up with this, you know, that being your family and growing up, you know, having that exposure to the King Ranch, how did that, you talked about it a little bit, but how did that, you know, impact your own personal like land ethic and your own views on wildlife and land conservation? If you ask anyone who's associated with your work here about how they got involved originally,
my guess is that they would have a story of either a grandparent or a friend or but some experience outdoors is my guess, or someone grabbing their hand and
saying
let's go, right?
Yeah.
Today maybe that's a film,
Sure, yeah.
but some experience and someone that helped them begin that journey. And so I was fortunate enough to have not only parents but cowboys and geneticists and wildlife biologists and businessmen and women whose sole purpose in life was to sustainably use a natural resource, multiple facets of that, right? But ultimately, if the soil wasn't healthy, then the grass wasn't healthy and productive, and you didn't have feed for cattle, and you didn't have habitat for wildlife, and so it wasn't theoretical. It was practical. Like the things that you were doing and were conserving were, and again, not just for economic reasons. That's not the only driver, but there were very practical reasons for doing the things that you were doing,
Right.
and even studying the things that you were studying. And as a kid, I spent a lot of time fishing and hunting and roaming around on my own. And so I had not just one experience, I had a lot of experiences that through osmosis and through a little bit of study, I would argue later on in life, became just sort of enamored by and in a sense of responsibility to pass that down. And you hear this from a lot of Lone Star land stewards, right? Is to pass this down to the next generation.
Absolutely.
And it's not theoretical. They really do mean that. And they don't mean just their own generation. They mean all of those who benefit from healthy land, air, and water and wildlife. And you're also seeing now, I think, and this isn't new to this generation, but also an emphasis on the things that aren't just game animals.
Oh, sure.
You look at what's happening now, the spring migration of shorebirds and songbirds and waterfowl and all of that stuff, and what's happening legislatively at the federal level, even with Recovering America's Wildlife Act, is a emphasis on the things that you don't have a necessary. It's not a game animal. You can't hunt it necessarily, but we appreciate it. And I think a lot of that comes from private landowners who are out there every day and really care about it.
Who are out there and, they're seeing, they're seeing these animals, and they're seeing, how their land has changed. They're seeing how, it all meshes together, right? Yeah. Like if one species is missing, then that's going to have an impact on another species.
Exactly.
And so it's all got to work together.
Yeah. And it's almost like, again, you don't have to be a scientist, or you don't have to be a private landowner to see this. But, I was talking with one of your locals here, Chuck Nizer, a couple of days ago, and Chuck's value in not only value, but in a conversation about habitat or oysters or a fishery is he's on the water almost every day.
Yeah.
And so he has seen the changes that you or I may have to read about over, a certain period of time. And I think it's the same with whether you're a cowboy or a scientist or you're a landowner, is you're there every day. And so you really do. I think there's a quote, and it may just be general. It may be, but my father imparted upon me that there's nothing better for land than a man or a woman's shadow.
Yeah.
And I think that's obviously you can take that into other parts of your life, but being there is really important. And so I think that's some of what I've learned, over the years.
Yeah. And you mentioned at the top of our conversation that, you're a father, and that's a big part. It's a huge part of your life, obviously. And so being able to, I'm sure, impart that same kind of, those same thoughts onto your daughters and helping them understand, we were talking when you first came in about, watching you two on the Devil's River. Yeah. And, there was a part that particularly struck me. She said, "Is this going to be here when I'm grown up?" Mm-hmm. And so I think that really plays into, exactly what you said. In the next generation, really caring about these things, and they're the ones that are going to make sure that, you know, a lot of these things are still here and are taken care of. So,
and to me, to the degree that I can, it's showing them by example.
Yeah.
In my actions, not just telling them that this is important.
Mm-hmm.
And so it just happens to be what I've decided to dedicate part of my life to. Other people dedicate it to other things. But I think they would probably say something similar, is they have to see me. And sometimes that means that you're not there.
Yeah.
Because you're working outdoors.
You're out doing
not
the things.
in the house.
Yeah.
But my hope is that they'll forgive me for the time that I was away, because I was trying to conserve some of the things that I think are going to be important to them.
Of course.
In their future lives, you know.
Okay. Well, talking about, you know, sharing the outdoors and sharing, you know, your views on conservation with others. Gosh, we've got a lot of things to cover here, from film to, I want to briefly mention Explore Ranches.
Mm-hmm.
So you're a co-founder of Explore Ranches. So tell us a little bit about what that is.
So some of the impetus for that business, which provides opportunities for travelers to visit private lands. That's kind of the one-line summary. The mission of that entity started really with looking at, when I was at Parks and Wildlife Foundation, just the limited amount of access we actually do have in Texas. And, you know, we talk about it as a 95% privately owned state. But if you break down that 5% that's public, only half of that is truly accessible to you or me or the rest of the public. So we're talking about 2.5% of the state. And a lot of that is here, Padre Island National Seashore, Mustang Island, Goose Island, et cetera, right? And so I thought, you know, I have access to a lot of private land just having grown up in a place that I grew up, but not everybody has that opportunity. And so we started thinking about, me and my partners, not just that issue of access, but how do we further develop a connection between people that, for the most part, are living in cities, and what's happening on this private land that may be at the headwaters of the Devil's River, or it may be in the middle of the Davis Mountains. It may be in the Big Bend region, or now it may be in Scotland or Montana near Glacier, Costa Rica, all of these places. So how do we make those connections? And then looking at the trends that we're seeing now, which is, you'll have the largest transfer of assets in our world's history in the next decade or so. And the large majority of that is in land. And so if you're seeing a huge transfer of assets to a generation that, in some cases, like me, are living in a city and may not have, although I grew up on the ranch, some may not have had that opportunity, and so they've lost a little bit of that connection. So how do we solve for this issue and generate some revenue for landowners, so it's part of the mix, so we keep these places wild and open? That's the mission. And now we've got over 1 million acres that's in the portfolio.
Wow. And
a lot of that is in Ted Turner's ranches out in New Mexico, because he's got some really big land holdings. And his mission is to use ecotourism as a revenue generator for their conservation efforts. So they've got reintroduction of wolves. They've got some work that they're doing on turtles and other conservation work. And they want ecotourism to be able to fund that. So that's the essence of the business.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. I'm sure that gives, you know, just like you said, it gives people that would otherwise never have that opportunity or may have lost that connection. You know, it gives them something that's kind of once in a lifetime, right?
Completely.
Yeah. Especially, I mean, gosh, any, you know, traveling anywhere in the Davis Mountains or anywhere out in the Big Bend, you know, those are just parts of Texas that a lot of people, you know, it's way out there and they may not have the opportunity to visit. And so just getting that chance, it's very cool. So,
and an appreciation. So, you know, to test this out, I took 2 friends who are not from Texas out to the Davis Mountains. And we hiked for a couple of days, and it was nothing fancy, but we got into Madera Canyon in that area, and you can see the McDonald's Observatory and the over the mountains there. And then there's a huge rock art artifact there that's probably 20 feet tall.
Wow.
And so you sort of are in this environment that humans have been inhabiting for 10,000 years or so, right? And so we get out of that and we're kind of hiking out through the clouds, as sometimes you'll see in the Davis Mountains. And they had an appreciation for it. They were like, wow, this is really amazing. And they said, I didn't think Texas looked like this.
100%.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I've been driving around the state for a number of years now. And I always wonder, gosh, I wonder what it's like, like across the fence there.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, this is cool. We can't do it for everybody, and we can't do it in all parts of the state. But our hope is that ultimately people appreciate these places. And also the landowner too sees other people appreciating what they're doing and what they're stewarding, just like Lone Star Land Stewards is meant to do and other things. And so hopefully it's this like ecosystem that we're building and all the work that we're doing to try and keep these places wild,
Yeah, it just continues that cycle of stewardship and conservation. So that's great.
Yeah.
So heading into, we'll stay on the Big Bend a little bit. I could talk about the Big Bend all day long.
Yeah.
And, so I'll try to rein myself in a little bit, but I lived out there for a little while in another life. I was a park interpreter at Big Bend Ranch State Park.
Okay.
I was at Fort Leaton State Historic Site. So, means a lot to me. I don't live there anymore, but it's definitely still where my heart is. So, I want to talk a little bit about film, and it's a really good time to talk about it because this episode will be available before our See to Screen Film Festival, June 7th at Alamo Drafthouse. Corresponds World Ocean Day, so
love it.
Pretty great timing.
Yeah.
So you're a producer for Fin and Fur Films. Fin and Fur was founded by Ben Masters, which I'm sure listeners and viewers probably recognize that name now, thanks to Deep in the Heart. So again, I could spend this whole podcast talking about Fin and Fur Films, but I think before I go too far, if people have not seen Deep in the Heart, if they haven't seen The River and the Wall, and they don't want to know what is going on in those films, maybe tune out because there might be some spoilers here. I don't know. I don't want anyone to tune out of our podcast, but so you were a producer, and also you were a character in The River and the Wall, and that film was very meaningful to me, considering it does feature a lot of the Big Bend. And so 5 of you traveled the length of the Texas-Mexico border from El Paso to the Gulf of Mexico, along the Rio Grande, and via various modes of transportation. So tell us a little bit about that film. And for those who haven't seen it, kind of describe a little bit about the Rio Grande and why it's so much more than just a river, and why it's so important from a conservation and wildlife management standpoint. Yeah,
there was a lot of talk at that time, so 17, 18, about the river and the Texas-Mexico border. And, one of the things that Ben saw, and then the rest of us exceedingly, was we had spent time in various areas, and there was a lot of misconceptions about the biological value, ecological value of not just the river, right? The only water source in the middle of a desert,
right?
The only water source to the Rio Grande Valley, and that a large majority of the water that enters into and then ends at Boca Chica in the Gulf comes out of Mexico, out of the state of Chihuahua. And then on top of that, you've got research that's going on at Borderlands Research Institute that's talking about the connectivity between black bears and other species that are coming out of Mexico ultimately, and are a benefit to us as Texans. And so we really wanted to showcase that. And the only way to do that, as you know, is you've got to get on the river, right? You have to get into the into that ecosystem, and it changes. Like literally every 50 or 100 miles, it changes from Chihuahuan Desert and high desert to what you've got in the Big Bend, which is kind of a mixture of all that stuff. And you've got the high islands, you've got Chisos, you've got Boquillas and the Sierra Madres across the border. You've got a wild and scenic section, which is the only one that we've got of a river in Texas. These are national designations, and then on and on and on. And so I think the idea was, let's go see it for ourselves, and let's bring some people along too who haven't traveled the entire length of it. Really, none of us had, but who aren't even from the area, right? Yeah. Heather, who's in the film, is from New York originally, but she's a trained ornithologist, was doing work in the Big Bend on cuckoo. And anyway, so that was the result. And I think, as you're finding with this podcast and what you're doing yourself with film, is you have to meet people where they're at and how they are consuming information. And increasingly, we're all consuming information in so many different ways. And so film is just one way. And it's a way also of, if it's a feature film that you can get into the theater, then, and Ben talks a lot about this, is it's somewhat of a religious experience. Oh gosh, in absolutely. terms of sitting down and being focused on one thing, kind of like trail running, right? Yeah. You're focused on one thing. You can leave, obviously. Most people don't. But you're sitting there and you're consuming something and thinking about really one thing for about 60 minutes or however long the film is. It's very rare these days. Most definitely. And so I got really interested after that in that mode of communication, because I think that truly a picture can tell 1,000, it's worth 1,000 words. And that I think you can move people in a way through that medium that is very unique. Yeah, most definitely. You're watching a film like The River and the Wall, and you're entertained, obviously. I'm sitting there watching it. I just went back before you got here and watched a few of the scenes, and so particularly that when you guys are in the lower canyons and you've got these loaded down canoes and you're going over these Class 3 rapids, and I'm just holding my breath because one of the only time I've been on the river, it was my friend Katie and I. She had bought a canoe, and so she's just like, "You want to go?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure, why not?" Yeah. And so we launched at Rancherias in Big Bend Ranch, and then took out at Lower Madera. So I know that's kind of mumbo jumbo unless you've been on the river, but one of the greatest adventures of my life. And I mean, we totally flipped our canoe, and we had it was such a great trip. Yeah. And so I'm watching you guys do this incredible epic adventure, and I'm entertained. And of course I'm loving all of the beautiful scenery, and you got there's a point you guys just stop and you're looking at Bighorn, like standing there and talking about how they probably crossed the river. That's their water source, and one of them has a collar. And so, but you're seeing all of these things, and you don't realize that you're also learning. Yeah. And you're walking away with a much bigger message. And so, I would be interested, was there something that was, particularly memorable to you about that trip? Favorite part of that trip? Yeah. Or maybe least favorite part? I can imagine, the mountain bikes through the mud was probably the least favorite, although it was also the most memorable. Yeah. If you've lived out or been out to Big Bend, that you can get freezes and snowstorms that come through there pretty quickly. And so we had one come through, and we were all totally unprepared. I mean, most of us are wearing shorts at that point, and we're riding bikes through that part of that stretch of the Rio Grande River. There's a pretty broad delta or floodplain, and because you've got less flow now, it's all pretty permanently mud. Although when it's dry, it's easy to ride across. And so increasingly, as that snow melted, we went from being able to ride through it to it just completely gumming up everything on our bikes. So they turned from 30-pound vehicles to 80-pound things that we had to lug for about 20. It was 30 miles. Wow. So we were cold, and it's pretty remote. We didn't have any support at that point. I think probably that stretch from Amistad down to Laredo is not an area that most people are familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
It's relatively flat. It's a lot of farmland, but it's really pretty. There's an area that the river flows through these limestone like flutes, or channels, and they're you're on the water in a canoe, and so they're maybe 3 or 4 feet above either side of you.
Wow.
And it's a rapid. It's not a class 3 or 4 or anything like that, but just the beauty. And we caught fish when we were down there. So I think generally how underrepresented and how misunderstood that river itself is, the challenges that it faces in terms of how much water we actually enters into the river itself, and then reaches the Gulf, and what that does to our barrier islands and sediment flow and bays and estuaries and all that stuff. Just the connectivity. And I think that was the part of the start of the thought to do Deep in the Harte.
Okay.
Was you had this one part of Texas that we're seeing people who are on the trip with us amazed by.
Right.
And we're saying, well, if you like this, you should see Caprock. If you like this, you should see the East Texas,
Yeah.
And then also people who've been involved in bigger productions like at National Geographic and PBS Nature and others who are like, it became totally possible, right, to think about doing a film about the diversity of Texas in a manner that you would see on planet Earth or our planet. That quality, that kind of take on wildlife and habitat. And so that then kind of spawned the next film, which is Deep in the Harte.
Man, that's great. Like excellent transition into Deep in the Harte. So, I think it is such an overall just, beautiful showcase of the state of Texas and, our wildlife and our landscapes. And, I certainly walked away like, man, I'm really proud to be a Texan after watching that. It's one of those things where, you'll go to a place and you'll take a picture and you might bring it back and show somebody and say, oh, well, the photos don't do it justice. I think this film did do a lot of justice for a lot of these places. And so you captured so many aspects of the state. Just like you said, you've got East Texas, you've got the Gulf, you've got Caprock. Like what kind of planning for a film that is covering such a large state with so many different ecoregions? Like how long did you guys sit and plan and for this production to come together? Yeah,
it total time was about 3 years from start of conception to having the film release. And as far as films go, like The River and the Wall started conception to release was about a year and a half.
Okay.
That's pretty short time frame because you think you have to come up with whatever it is that you think you want to film, and then you have to raise the money to go out and do it, and then you actually have to go film it. And with wildlife, as you know, they don't always follow the script.
Cooperate, sure.
And so Ocelot was about a 6 to 12 month process of gathering game camera footage, and then figuring out the trap system because it wasn't working, and then making sure that you have cameras and the box system that it sits in that are not corroding the camera inside and all of that stuff. And then Mountain Lion, which was in the Davis Mountains, that's footage that's essentially captured on camera traps. Then you have to change the batteries every few weeks. So you have to have someone go down in, change these camera trap batteries, and then make sure that the camera actually works and that you got the right angle and all of that stuff. So, about 3 years plus, when you look at who all is involved and you see it in the credits, it's like 100 people.
That's incredible.
Between those who support you and those who are filming, and then producers, and all, by the way, not for you're not necessarily getting rich off any of this stuff.
Sure,
it's a labor of love from a lot of people's perspective. And then to identify, there's a little bit of a process to identify what you think is going to be a compelling story. That's one. And then two, it's okay, let's talk to the scientist about what behavior might be interesting, and then where would you go to film that behavior?
Yeah.
And then going through the checklist of, okay, if we actually capture this, is anybody going to think that it's interesting?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, sure. It's always a fear.
And that's what's been interesting to me on the being sort of an outsider on the filmmaking process is you also learn to sort of filter information. So somebody who's a biologist may say, man, freshwater mussels is where it's at.
Yeah.
And you have got to go. And it's super important, right?
Of course.
But translating that to something that people are going to want to see and build a story around it are completely different. So there's a lot of stuff that ends up not making the film. Sandhill cranes, beautiful. You know, you've got that whole ecosystem of freshwater pothole prairie up in the Panhandle. And Ben and a team had caught some of the sandhill cranes during a snowfall. So really, really beautiful footage. But you only have 80 minutes, and so it didn't make the cut.
Wow.
So it's a really, from my perspective, being intellectually curious, caring about Texas, loving wildlife and its diversity. There's no more fulfilling and exhilarating process than to do the filming, because you essentially get somewhat of a PhD or a master's in each of these subjects.
Absolutely.
Because you got to know enough to pass the test.
Yeah.
If a biologist watches this and they say that's
it's got to be factually accurate, right?
That's not this, that's not a blind salamander. That's whatever. And then just condensing it into a form with a few words of like getting to the point and making it interesting for people. It's a really cool like mode of communication.
Yeah, most definitely. I think what's also interesting about this film, just the range of emotions that I think you go through while watching it.
Yeah.
We did a showing here on campus at the Performing Arts Center, and it was just really cool to be, I think a lot of people had probably seen the film by this point. It was in September of last year. But it was just really cool to be in that room and hear people, just rooting for a bat.
Right.
They're like cheering for the bat, and you can also hear like just the collective like sadness when you're seeing this ocelot like calling out for a cub.
Yeah.
And but also the room just erupted in cheers whenever the narrator, may or may not heard of Mr. Matthew McConaughey, says, our camera team disabled this trap.
Yes,
and so everyone just starts cheering. But it was just, it's so neat to go through those range of emotions while you're watching this, but at the same time, thinking, especially the bats, seeing the bat flight at Brackenback Cave, and you're seeing these little bats that, I of course, I know that nature is a little hardcore and some things are going to be a little rough to watch, but you're seeing these little bats that have fallen and they're trying to get up to a higher ground so that they can take off again, but they've got, snakes coming up behind them. And then the ones that are already in the air have hawks flying around. And, while I'm watching this, I'm rooting for the bats, but at the same time, all I'm thinking is, this is incredible. This is an incredible shot. Like, how did they do that? So are there any shots that, particularly still when you go back and watch it, that really stand out to you and that you're really, really proud of?
Yeah, I think, so we put Skip Hobby, or he put himself on a scissor lift up about 20 or so feet just off the edge of Bracken Cave. And as you saw in that footage, you've got this swirl of bats that start coming up. And when you're standing on the edge, you can actually feel the rush of wind.
Wow.
And smell it.
Yeah, of course.
But you can feel it. And then Skip is on the edge because you've got Austin Alvarado that's down closer to the mouth of the cave, and you can only get so close without a respirator. So he's got a respirator on because of ammonia that's coming out of the cave. And he's filming the emergence. And then you've got some really cool shots of, millions of bats that are, it's a view of the sky. So you see just, how many there are. And then he's got some cameras trained on a rat snake that is dangling off the edge. You probably don't remember it because there was so much of the coach whips. But there's a rat snake that is dangling out off the edge
Wow.
of the cave, and its tail is wrapped around a cactus,
Mm-hmm.
and it catches a bat in midair. And we'd heard about this stuff, right? Like you
Yeah.
hear about it from Bat Conservation International, but to actually see it in action and then capture it and all of that, you realize what goes into it, because those cameras are, and the gear is very heavy.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like you're hunting or bird watching. The wildlife has to come to you.
Right.
So Skip's on this scissor lift, and a peregrine is diving, and you see peregrine, you see northern harrier and red tails
Mm-hmm.
in the film diving. Well, they're going like 40, 50 miles an hour.
Wow.
And so you think about trying to get it on your camera with a telephoto lens, and then follow it and keep it in focus. There's no autofocus on these cameras. So he's having to follow something that's diving at 50 miles an hour, and then follow it as it slows down and then captures a bat in flight. That to me is like beyond, once you know what's required to do that, I was watching the film on Sunday. We were in Bryan for a screening, and I happened to walk back. I leave the theater now because I've seen it so many times.
Sure, yeah.
And I went and got something to eat, but I came back in, and I could have easily left, and I wanted to stick around and watch that scene again, because it's really just amazing.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I'm sure at the end of that, he's like, well, I'm done. This is as good as it's going to get.
That's it.
So, there's a lot of conservation messages throughout the film. And so if you had to, give somebody advice who's just watched Deep in the Heart and they want to get more involved some way, shape or form with, conservation or wildlife conservation, like what advice would you give? I mean, I know that's kind of a loaded question, but
I think what I've learned in doing those films, and then being involved in conservation, and then doing some research into the history of conservation, specifically in Texas, whether that's the establishment of Big Thicket or Padre Island National Seashore, Big Bend National Park, how that came into creation, Big Bend Ranch State Park, is you can trace almost every initiative to either an individual or a small group that maybe nobody was listening to at the time, but ultimately they cared about something enough to withstand either ridicule or doubt. And they obviously cared about something enough to tell a good enough story where enough people believed in them as well. And then it ultimately got to the right people, or it became such a large movement that an institute like Harte was created,
right?
Or that someone decided to focus on oysters when nobody else was, or a particular habitat that they knew we were going to lose if we didn't save it. And so what I would say is, whatever it is that you decide to do, whatever it is that you care about, whether it's a species or habitat or a resource like water, that whatever it is that you do matters, one, and you have to believe that. And then two, that whatever you do, it will make a difference. And so whether that's supporting a conservation organization, if it's going to a film night that you all have, and are supporting other filmmakers, that you never know the impact that you're going to have. And you may not see it, but somebody may watch your film, and 30 years later, they're a scientist and they're studying a particular species.
Yeah.
And so I think that ultimately is one of the takeaways from that film, is that, look, there are a lot of challenges that we're facing. And if you lived in the late 1800s, we would also be seeing some things that we thought we're not going to come back from.
Of course.
And that to keep up the faith, and also know that what you're doing and what you care about, that it can have an impact.
Talking about kind of, just watching this film and it being, something that can, help people to just not only be proud of, their state and where they're from, but, also like remembering why they care. And so I remember seeing the trailer for this film, and it was on just probably one of my worst days.
Mm-hmm.
It was in my previous position. I was dealing with some really, really heavy stuff, and you know, it was just kind of one of those like, man, I don't know if I can do this.
Yeah.
You know, and so but I saw that. I just like opened Instagram, you know, kind of scrolling, just trying to get my mind off things, and I saw the trailer, and I remembered, okay, this is it. This is why I do this.
Mm-hmm.
This is why, you know, I've got such a weird background in journalism, and then, you know, a master's in agriculture. So what do I do with that? So I've got this weird background, but I'm in this opportunity. I have this opportunity to tell stories, and this is why I do it, because I love these places. I love these animals. And I think, you know, again, through Deep in the Heart, people are able to, you know, to recognize like these places are important, mm-hmm. and I want to do what I can to, you know, help and make sure that they're around. So
yeah, and I think we early on in fundraising for some of these films got a little bit of pushback from some of the traditional foundations, mm-hmm. and understandably, because they're used to funding programs or capital improvement projects or acquiring land. On the conservation side, there's sort of like a set of things that people are used to traditionally funding. Mm-hmm. And so you kind of wonder at that point, I remember thinking, well, then if they're not interested in it, well, then maybe no one else will be,
right.
Or maybe it doesn't matter, right? It's to put a bad label on it. It's just a movie, right? Mm-hmm. But I think that you could probably say that about a lot of different things. Yeah. And I think collectively what everyone's doing in the conservation space individually on, you know, set on its own, might not have a huge impact, but collectively, if we're all pushing in the same direction, mm-hmm. then I think it does have an extreme impact.
It takes all of us.
It takes everybody.
Yeah.
And not, you're obviously going to question what you're doing. I think everybody does in whatever line of work you're in, but like not letting that set you back.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's transition a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about the future and what you have coming up. So we're all super excited about this here at HRI. So you've got an upcoming film called Chasing the Tide, and it's going to highlight the Texas coast, but it's so much more than that. So tell us a little bit about the idea behind the film and what it's going to showcase and who all is involved.
Yeah. So I spent, you know, probably I guess I grew up on the coast, but I didn't think about that I was growing up on the coast, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, David Yaskowitz and I think Greg Stuntz and Carter Smith all have said over their professional careers that Texas thinks of itself as a state with a coast,
right, and not a
rather than a coastal
state.
state.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I started work with Parks and Wildlife Foundation about 10 years ago, I guess. And at that point, we were starting to try and figure out how to utilize some of the Deepwater Horizon settlement funds, and ended up on the project team that was working at Powderhorn Ranch, and ended up conserving that. And today it's a wildlife management area, and it will be a state park in the future. And really, that was my first dive into coastal issues, and because we were essentially having to pitch Powderhorn Ranch as the first big investment from the Gulf Environmental Benefit Fund in Texas.
Okay.
And so we were talking about coastal erosion. We were talking about sea level rise. We were talking about the loss of coastal prairie and wetlands, and the function of that coastal prairie and conserved land along the Texas coast in terms of freshwater inflow and quality, all of this stuff, right? Mm-hmm. So fast forward to a few months ago, and you know, I'd spent the last year really talking about coastal issues, and decided that to truly understand the position that I was going into, which was executive director of Gulf of Mexico Trust, and some of the work that I would be doing, why not get on the ground and not just sort of hop in and out of areas like Palacios and Bolivar Peninsula and Brownsville and Corpus, but why not walk the coast.
Wow.
And so we decided back about 3-4 months ago that my wife and I would walk the coast, the barrier islands specifically. There are 7 of them. There are 15 passes from the Louisiana-Texas border all the way down to the Rio Grande River.
Okay.
So we had this idea, and I didn't know that it had any legs. And I happened to be sitting in a meeting with PBS Austin with their leadership,
Okay.
talking about something totally unrelated. But this is a good lesson.
Okay.
Is when you're running or when you have some free time, always have like something in the hopper.
Sure. Yeah.
That if somebody asks you, so what's going on, or if we could provide you with the resources, what would you want to do?
Yeah.
So I said, I got this crazy idea to walk the Texas coast, but I don't know if anybody's going to be interested in this. And these are the issues that I think we could tackle, but I don't want to work on the distribution side because I know how difficult it is to get these films in front of people. And they said, you know what? We're interested. So why don't you come back in 30 days and pitch us on what the budget looks like and what all of these things look like. And so we've started filming already because we realized that we're going to walk in October. We'll do 20 miles a day.
Okay.
And that to film all of the topics, songbird migration at High Island, ghost wolves, which are canids up in Galveston with red wolf genetics, tarpon, the return of tarpon, oysters, and all that they provide in terms of ecosystem services and what's happening there and how freshwater inflow impacts those populations, salinity levels, whooping cranes and Oplomata falcons and turtles. If we want to film all of this stuff, you actually have to do it outside of the walk.
Yeah.
So that's what we're doing right now is filming a lot of these things. And we'll do a book. We'll do some educational lesson plans associated with that PBS will host on their site. And all of that will be broadcast and streaming August of next year.
Man, that's going to be awesome. I'm really excited about it. So what, this is 370 miles?
370 miles.
20 miles a day.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what kind of preps are going into this trip? Are you guys are you camping along the way? Are you gonna, okay.
So it's
a backpacking trip.
I think, take a look at the coast and wherever you've got some kind of population, we'll probably be staying with folks to kind of get resupplied and
fair enough,
all that. But when you get south of Freeport, so where the Colorado River enters the Gulf of Mexico, East Matagorda Peninsula, San Jose Island, that's like roughly, I'll be off a little bit, but 100 miles.
Okay.
Where there is nothing.
Yeah.
Now there's a refuge that Parks and Wildlife manages, which is Matagorda Island. And there's some infrastructure like an old Army airfield there, but really it's uninhabited.
Mm-hmm.
And so we'll be camping that whole stretch. And then we'll camp all of Padre Island National Seashore. So I'm really excited about it because and I was talking to my daughter has me in front of her school a couple of weeks ago talking about lessons that I've learned in being curious.
Okay. That's great. I love it.
And so I use this as an example. I said, I'm curious about the coast, mm-hmm. and I can take a bunch of people's word for it for sure, or I can go walk it and do, the required research in the process. And I'm talking to like third graders, so I didn't use the word process, but I realized, this is important. And my hope is that, it's a movie, but I do think that it could spawn other things and create some awareness really around how important the coast is.
Absolutely. We
got, a fifth of the population is here. We've got the largest petrochemical plant in between Houston and Port Arthur in the world. Mm-hmm. We've got tremendous amount of the effects of sea level rise will hit Galveston more so than any other part of the world. And, if people are aware of these, if they're not aware of them, they can't do anything about them.
Sure.
If they are aware of them, then they have a choice to make. And so that's what we're trying to do.
That's great. You guys will get to see, all of these things firsthand, and being out there for so long, you'll probably start to notice how things might be a little different. But some great sunrises and sunsets along the way. I
say it's my wife and I are just taking a long walk on the
beach.
There
you go.
So if anybody wants to join us, they're welcome. We're going to need some just variety as we go down the coast.
For sure. Well, when can we expect the film, and where can people go to learn some more about it?
Yeah. So we have a website, and it's chasingthetidefilm.com. And so people can get an idea of the website there. We're about halfway through our fundraising. So if they're interested in that and supporting us that way, they can follow us. So we've got Instagram and Facebook. We have someone nearby that's living on Padre Island who's helping us with our communications.
Excellent.
There. And you all have been helpful as well. And so I would just say follow along. And we're going to be in the process of making this film really for the next year or so. And then it'll be on PBS out of Austin, and hopefully statewide, and then maybe even nationally starting in August of next year.
That's so exciting. It's going to get a lot more eyes on the Texas coast, and showing how important it is, and that we are a coastal state, not just a state with a coast.
That's right.
So before you leave, I want to talk about the Gulf of Mexico Trust a little bit. I know we're in just the beginning stages, but you're the executive director, and you guys are just getting started. So tell us a little bit about what it is, and what's the mission, and what can you tell our viewers and listeners about what you're going to do?
So we're brand new. We're about 3 months old, and the mission of the Gulf of Mexico Trust is really to tackle some of the Gulf of Mexico and the Texas coast greatest challenges with Texas-based, science-backed solutions. And so if you look at some areas that we're going to be focused on are coastal resiliency. How do communities prepare for natural disasters? Mm-hmm. How do we equip some communities that maybe don't have the resources to prepare for the next hurricane or the next flood? Looking at issues that involve multiple stakeholders like oysters, natural reefs, artificial reefs, mariculture, all that's involved in that. How can we be a convener of sort and try and be helpful in providing practical solutions to what we know is a dwindling resource? And so we're slowly but surely identifying what those topics are. And the way that I think about it is, there's going to be a certain set of issues that are very urgent. Mm-hmm. And one that may come to a lot of people's mind are oysters. We know that there's a lot of focus on that right now. We know that the availability of water and freshwater inflow to our bays and estuaries is critical, not just to our coastal environments, but also as a nursery for the Gulf of Mexico, and also the people that are moving and thriving here on the Texas coast. We all need water. Yeah. So those are some urgent issues that we're going to tackle, and then there are issues that are longer term, and we want to make sure that when you and I are gone, and I'm not going to guess your age, but 100 years from now, at least, that what we did mattered. Sure. And that what we've enabled is a vibrant economy and a sustainable ecosystem at the same time. Mm-hmm. And so that's what we're charged. That's what I'm charged with doing. And we're putting the team together right now, and really excited about what we're going to be doing. That's great. I know we're all really excited, to partner with you guys and be there to lend a hand. And, just me from the communication side, I'm happy to always share your messaging and help get the word out. So really excited, and we'll have to have you come back at a later date when you guys, are a little bit farther into things and talk about how the progress is going. And I think that you bring up a really important point, that none of this is possible without Harte Research Institute and the science that's occurring up and down the coast. And it's been a great partnership so far. We're in the early stages of it, but really just fortunate to be in this position and to be working on these issues with you all.
Well, we're fortunate to have you. So, all right. Well, Jay Kleberg, thanks so much for being on the Gulf Stream. And again, don't be a stranger. Come back soon.
I'm around.
All right.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, consider contributing to a greater Gulf by visiting harteresearch.org. That's HARTE research.org.